Tudors, a series that made so many of us fall in love with English history and the captivating era of the Tudor dynasty. But today, in this video, let's take a closer look and ask, how accurate was it really? How much of what we saw on screen actually reflects historical truth? And how much was pure fiction? In today's video, I decided to bring together two of Henry VIII's wives, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, and look with you at what was true and what was pure invention in their stories, as shown in the Tudors series. Let's start with Anne of Cleves, a woman who's been so unfairly labelled by history, and by the Tudors itself, as the ugly wife, or the infamous Flanders mare. We'll begin with their first meeting, which is shown in the series but not quite accurately. The real story was much more dramatic, and that famously awkward introduction pretty much ruined their relationship from the start. Henry was so eager to see his new bride that he rode ahead to Rochester, but he decided to disguise himself so Anne wouldn't recognise him as the king. This brilliant idea was inspired by the romantic legend of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, where Henry disguised himself as a squire to surprise her. Henry VIII loved this story and wanted to recreate it, hoping Anne would instantly see through the disguise and fall into his arms. But nothing went as planned. Windsor Herald Charles Wriothesley describes the moment like this: "The King's Grace, with 5 of his privy chamber, being disguised with cloaks of marble with hoods, that they should not be known, came privily to Rochester, and so went up into the chamber where the said Lady Anne looked out at a window to see the bull baiting. That was that time in the court. And suddenly he embraced her and kissed, and showed her a token that the king had sent her for her New Year's gift, and she, being abashed, not knowing who it was, thanked him. And so he communed with her, but she regarded him little, but always looked out of the window on the bull baiting." In other words, Anne was completely distracted watching the bull baiting. Well, entertainment was limited before the internet, and she ignored Henry. She had no idea who he was or what he was trying to do. It seems things weren't entirely catastrophic, because they did talk afterward and smoothed things over a bit. But Henry's fragile ego was bruised. That disastrous first impression happened in front of both Anne's ladies and Henry's own men. Plus, there were cultural differences. Anne didn't speak English well, and her fashion sense, considered very stylish in Cleves, didn't translate to English tastes, which preferred Italian and French styles. Anne grew up with heavier gowns and round skirts popular in Germany and the Netherlands, which didn't flatter her figure in English eyes. Her headdress also looked very different from the English hood, favoured by Jane Seymour, or the French hood, loved by Anne Boleyn. It was really a matter of bad luck and bad timing, an awkward first meeting and unfamiliar fashion. When Henry returned to Greenwich, he reportedly told Sir Anthony Browne, "I see nothing in this woman as men report of her." In the Tudors, Henry calls Anne a mare, but that's actually a popular historical myth. While Henry treated his wives terribly in many ways, he tried to keep up the image of a gentleman in public and would not have openly insulted a foreign princess in such crude terms. So, where did this phrase come from? It traces back to Bishop Gilbert Burney, who wrote in 1679, long after Henry's death, that the king swore they had brought him a Flanders mare, but there's no contemporary evidence Henry ever said it. Still, it was such a colourful phrase that it stuck in popular history and in TV scripts. And if we talk about Anne's looks more fairly, she was 24 at the time, much younger than Henry at 47, who by then was overweight and in poor health. No one else seems to have found Anne unattractive or doubted Holbein's portrait. If anything had been badly wrong, the people sent to greet her, like Charles Brandon, Henry's closest friend, would have surely warned him. By all accounts, Anne made a good impression on most people. As for the famous rumour about her bad body odour, the morning after their wedding night, Henry claimed she smelled very badly. Frankly, that's a bit rich coming from a man with an ulcerated leg that was known to reek horribly. He expected perfection, and perhaps Anne used perfumes he disliked, or maybe their personal chemistries just didn't match. But there's no real evidence she had any special problem. It's more likely Henry was simply disappointed and looking for excuses. In the Tudors, Henry also says Anne had a bad breast and didn't look like a virgin. He did actually say something similar to his physicians. He found her body in such sort disordered and indisposed to excite and provoke any lust in him. But was Anne a virgin? almost certainly. She seems to have been so innocent that she didn't even understand what consummation meant, believing she had fulfilled her duty simply by kissing the king goodnight. So much of Anne's ugly wife reputation was about hurt feelings, cultural misunderstandings, and Henry's need for an excuse to get rid of her. She was a pawn in Tudor politics who deserved much better. Around this point in the series, Catherine Howard enters the story. She's introduced as the illegitimate child of a distant relative of the Duke of Norfolk, and the house where we first see her looks almost like a brothel. But this is where the series really twists the truth. Catherine actually belonged to the powerful Howard family, though to its poorer junior branch. Her father, Edmund Howard, was the younger son of the second Duke of Norfolk. That didn't make her some distant cousin, it made her the Duke's niece. She was also first cousin to Anne Boleyn and third cousin to Jane Seymour. Sending children to be raised in a great household was normal then. It wasn't a punishment, it was a chance to get education and connections. Catherine lived in the house of Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Agnes was wealthy and respected. Her household was busy and a bit chaotic, sure, but it was no den of vice. Catherine learned to read, write, danced, all the things expected of a noble girl. However, it seems the supervision was largely daytime only. At night, the young people were left much more to themselves. That's when Catherine began a sexual relationship with her relative, Frances Derham, who had recently been appointed as the Dowager Duchess's secretary. And this very naive first love, they even called each other husband and wife, would eventually lead this sweet pair to the scaffold. But that part of the story comes later. Catherine was around 16 or 17 when she went to court to serve as one of Anne of Cleves' ladies-in-waiting. And here's another inaccuracy in the Tudors. On screen, they show Catherine meeting Anne only after Anne is already Henry's former wife, and Catherine is queen herself. In reality, Catherine served Anne as queen, and Anne even noticed Henry's attention to her before their divorce was finalised. Anne's humiliating divorce, with all the intimate details of their failed marriage dragged out, ultimately granted her the very diplomatic and lucrative title of King's Sister. That divorce was finalised on the 9th of July 1540. Just weeks later, on 28th July, Henry and Catherine were quietly married in a small private ceremony. The news of their marriage was actually kept secret for more than a week. And here's another historical error in the show. On that very same day, Henry married Catherine. Thomas Cromwell was executed for charges of corruption, heresy, and treason. Henry would later bitterly regret Cromwell's death, accusing his own councillors of conspiring against him and feeding him false accusations. It's striking, isn't it? A marriage that began on the day of Cromwell's execution, Henry's trusted ally and friend, would end less than 2 years later with Catherine herself on the scaffold. It's kind of surprising that the show chose not to show this all happening on the same day. They really missed out on showing just how chilling it was that in the Tudor world, you could have a wedding and an execution practically back to back. As I just said, Catherine Howard would lose her head on the scaffold exactly 1 year, 6 months, and 16 days after her wedding, accused of adultery with the king, and the series is full of those steamy scenes of her affair with Thomas Culpeper. But did Catherine actually cheat on the king with Thomas in reality? We can't say that for sure. To begin with, they did have some sort of romantic relationship before Henry even noticed Catherine, when she was still Anne of Cleves' lady-in-waiting. By the way, they were actually distant relatives, since Catherine's mother's maiden name was Culpeper. Some historians suggest their relationship may have resumed in the spring of 1541, at a time when Henry withdrew from everyone and shut himself away in his rooms. There's also the theory that Catherine was pressured into the relationship, with Culpeper manipulating her, being a spoiled and dangerous young man. In any case, in the indictment against Catherine, there is no mention of Catherine having committed adultery, just of her will to return to her old abominable life, and her vicious and abominable purpose. It doesn't explicitly say that she slept with Culpeper, and is more about Catherine's intentions. The main accusation focused on her immoral life before her marriage to Henry, particularly with Derham. As for Culpeper himself, during interrogations about the secret meetings he'd had with Catherine at Lincoln, during the royal progress to the north, one of which lasted from 11 p.m. until about 3 a.m. He insisted they had simply talked of themselves and of their loves before time. Culpeper denied sleeping with Catherine, but stated that he intended and meant to do ill with the Queen, and that likewise the Queen was so minded with him. Lady Rochford, the same woman who was George Boleyn's wife, and who had served both Jane and Catherine, backed this up for the first meeting, saying she'd been present but was too far away to hear what they said, and that she'd fallen asleep the second time. However, she also stated, and I quote from the record of her interview, she thinks Culpeper has known the Queen carnally. She didn't see them make love, but she assumed they had. So, did Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper ever truly cross the line? The truth is, we may never know for certain. Their intense connection and the intent to do ill were considered treasonous in Henry VIII's court. In the end, Catherine's secret meetings and alleged intentions were enough to convict her, even if physical evidence of adultery remains unclear. Catherine was simply too young to understand what the Tudor court really was and what those courtly games meant. She didn't realise that her Howard family was seen as the Catholic faction at Henry's court. Even though England was officially Protestant by then, the idea of returning to the Catholic Church was still in the air. The Howards, and Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, being so close to the throne, made the Protestant faction deeply uneasy. In the series, Catherine is accused through an anonymous letter handed to Henry. In reality, the letter had a very clear author. It was written by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer himself, a committed Protestant. The Tudors series adds plenty of extra drama to Catherine's execution, and, of course, plenty of historical inventions. First, there's the moment when she arrives at the Tower and sees the heads of Culpeper and Derham in the corridor. That's pure fiction. In reality, their heads were displayed on London Bridge and remained there for quite some time. Also, the gap between the executions was much longer than the series suggests. Both men were executed on the 10th of December, 1541, while Catherine and Jane were executed on the 13th of February, 1542. And about that detail, everyone loves to mention that she asked for the block to practice laying her head on it. That actually is true, recorded by Ambassador Chapuis. But it's very unlikely she was naked at the time. Honestly, she was just too often shown naked in the series. Executions in the Tudor era were highly choreographed events with a strict, formal order. In the show, they depict Lady Rochford being executed before Catherine, but that's inaccurate. Traditionally, the highest-ranking person faced the axe ahead of the others. When George Boleyn was executed with the other men, he led the group because of his status. Likewise, as Queen, Catherine went before Lady Rochford. The show also invented the humiliating scene where Catherine wets herself on the scaffold. There's no evidence that happened. And there's that famous quote, often attributed to Catherine. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." It's a neat line for TV, but like many perfect historical quotes, there's no evidence she ever said it. Ambassador Chapuis actually wrote to the Emperor that neither the Queen nor Madame de Rochefort spoke much on the scaffold. All they did was to confess their guilt and pray for the king's welfare and prosperity. Of all of Henry VIII's wives, who were all undoubtedly victims of a tyrant, I somehow feel the most sympathy for Catherine Howard. She was the youngest and the most naive, and she likely didn't truly understand what Henry was really like or what survival at court required. Much like Jane Grey, the responsibility for her downfall lies with those who so desperately pushed her toward the throne. What do you think about Catherine Howard and Anne of Cleves, about their fates and how they were portrayed in the series? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to give this video a like. We're almost at the end. See you in the final video in this series, all about Catherine Parr.